Ready to begin? Good afternoon, I'm Hairong from the University from Welcome to our panel. Since our first presenter can attend today, so we only have two presenters on the panel. So we will start with Dr. Robert Bryan's presentation. Dr. Robert Bryan is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of British Columbia. His presentation is entitled Soil Science and Ontologies of Human and Modern Human Life.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I use this to advance it, or do I use
the arrow keys on
the arrow key? Okay. Okay. So, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. For my contribution today, I would like to introduce some artifacts. So I'll be talking about soil knowledge, and my artifacts are soil sample archives, or rather pictures of soil sample collections. This one's from the Rothamsted Agricultural Field Station in Harpenden in the UK, just north of London, which was founded in 1853 and which became the primary agricultural research station of the British Empire and remains an active field laboratory today. Rothamsted collected thousands of soil samples from around the world from the 1920s to the 1950s, and about 200 soil samples continue to be added annually. Initially, these samples were used to study nutrient content of soils, a standard practice of post-Lebesguean agricultural chemistry. Soil science for Rothamsted director Daniel Hall, early 20th century director, concerned what he called the active agencies in the organization of life, which form the basis of food, health, and population. And as a scientific matter, soil expertise involved thinking in terms of energy capture, conversion, and reuse within a limited system. So energies from the sun, soil, plants, and animals that became human bodies, became metabolism and movement, became work. And by the later 20th century, with analytical techniques, soil samples began to be used to study atmospheric changes and even to register nuclear fallout from atomic bomb experiments in the 1950s. So they remain a critical resource for what we might call Anthropocene science. In the context of the 20th century, colonial empire soil samples were assembled into centralized collections in the burgeoning field of soil science. Soil samples were often collected in the construction of soil mapping projects like this one. This is a soil mapping project from 1940s in British Somaliland. It's quite typical of a mid-century soil map. Studies of soil composition would be used to advise farmers on crops to grow, fertilizers, and other critical matters. But of course, soil mapping, which evolved in part out of cadastral surveying, had many other purposes, and especially establishing property boundaries and ownership, sometimes, as historian Joe Gouldy has shown, for a variety of settings in the British Empire and successor states to facilitate land reform. So soil maps were published and circulated widely, of course, but often soil samples were exchanged between centers of soil research as well, including and especially between large imperial nations in the early 20th century, like Russia, Germany, the UK, the British Empire, and the United States. So through traveling soil maps, soil samples, and traveling soil scientists, soil, this very symbol of place, locality, and fixity, was on the move from about the year 1900. Now, I've prepared this talk in part as a conceptual intervention, given our assignment to reread Jim's splendid essay. And I'm glad you're here, Jim. Because I love the essay. I agree with just about every word in it, but I have a slight quibble, and that defines part of my intervention. And the quibble concerns. I have a 2004 picture of it. So on page 660, this is of the ISIS article, of course. 661, Jim admonishes us, thinking about the future work in the kind of lecture that it was, to think about knowledge as a form of communicative action. And Jim's articulation of communicative action is, in his word, foundational. And this means, he says, thinking about every text, image, action, and object as a trace of a communication with receivers, producers, and modes of transmission. It means eradicating the distinction between the making and the communicating of knowledge. So this is a very capacious definition of communication, I think. And I think, so I think part of what I'm saying is I'm about to sort of articulate my criticism or my quibble, but I think in many respects, Jim's already anticipated it, but it's not quite there, I think, and this is my point. So I think that there are shortcomings in this formulation, and these are shortcomings that have been made more apparent since 2004 in the different forms of critique, especially in what has been called the ontological turn in STS, and in a parallel way, I think also in German media studies, by the turn from materialities of communications to cultural techniques, Kulturtechnik. The ontological turn in STS gave a name to a set of intuitions and sensibilities that have been gathering in the field for quite a while, and most broadly, a drive to reverse the tendency of modern philosophy to convert ontological questions into epistemological ones. The fundamental contribution of the ontological turn is its power to draw renewed critical attention to objects that might otherwise appear finished or ready-made, rather than taking them as black box and settled. So objects are instead enacted in practices, and scientific knowledge is a way of world making. So I mean, I think Jim gets us most of the way there with the idea that the distinction between making and communicating knowledge needs to be eradicated. And yet I think making doesn't quite capture what the ontological turn, it doesn't go as far as it's been admonishing us to do. And I think that's the point that I want to make and explore here. So this was also the fundamental, this point that I'm making here, the fundamental insight of the second generation German media theorists, also known as the Kittler youth, who recognized that beneath the materialities of communication that comprised the foci of their analyses, there were basic processes of becoming that they called cultural techniques. The result was to turn ontology into a domain of that which is in German taken by the word Kultur. Cultural techniques comprise not only self-referential, symbolic, and communicative practices like writing, reading, counting, and image making, but the analysis of artifacts as cultural techniques emphasizes their ontological status as in-betweens. Shifting from first order to second order techniques emphasizes their ontological status. Shifting from first and second order techniques, from the technical to the artistic, from object to sign, from the natural to the cultural, from the operational to the representational. So rather than draw out this conceptual discussion, I'd like to consider some examples from the history of soil science and related works of art that illustrate my point. One of the effects of looking at a soil sample collection or a soil map is to have the feeling that you know what soil is. Oh yes, you say, that's dirt in a jar, which is like all the other dirt I've walked on and grown my vegetables in and everything else. But this is the illusion of the ready-made, which surfaces when the multiple purposes and bodies of soil knowledge collide. Soil is at once topography, the basis of agricultural production, a reservoir of natural resources, a surface for travel and mobility, a landscape with aesthetic value, a mind-bogglingly dense multi-species environment, its property, its territory of states and political bodies, and much more. Soil science developed historically within a perceived set of nested problems, which included problems and crises in agriculture, land use, labor, migration, food systems, nutrition, health, population control, international relations, colonialism, anti-colonial resistance. So soil, this term, shows up very differently and often in contradictory and conflicting ways when treated from each of these concerns. Now, the model that I'm using to think about soil in this way is taken from Anne-Marie Moll's well-known book, The Body Multiple, Ontology in Medical Practice, which is one of the cardinal texts of the term to ontology in STS. Moll is, of course, a Dutch philosopher, ethnographer, who did field work in a hospital on the matter of atherosclerosis, a mundane medical entity. And what she found was that atherosclerosis meant very different things to different medical specialists, to clinicians who ran blood tests and managed biomarkers through pharmacology and lifestyle, to laboratory researchers doing research on animal models, to radiologists involved in imaging patients' arteries, surgeons doing cardiac bypass operations or placing stents, pathologists conducting post-mortem examinations. To each one of these different sets of practitioners, atherosclerosis meant something really distinctly different. And when she would interview them privately and press them, they typically didn't acknowledge the validity of the other ideas of atherosclerosis that their colleagues had. In other words, they really thought that their colleagues were making things up or something. And yet, these were also people who collaborated with patients in most cases, and so had to talk about a common phenomenon called atherosclerosis, even though they, in some sense, didn't credit the version that their collaborating colleagues had. So she discusses all of the ways that these gaps were smoothed over in practice through what she called coordinating efforts, and also discussing numerous cases where these gaps surfaced and had to be kind of the smoothing over process had to be kind of reasserted. It didn't flow automatically. Well, I think soil is a lot like atherosclerosis, a seemingly mundane object that, as it turns out, mostly comes into being as a scientific entity through specific practices of different kinds, and often becomes the object of crisis and contention when those practices don't converge. But unlike atherosclerosis, many practices pertaining to soil are enmeshed in politics of many forms, which dramatically raise the stakes on these gaps in definition. This is where mundane practices of enacting entities suddenly connect to larger histories, what Jim yesterday referred to as the problem of narrative scaling. So my interest in these mundane practices has to do with the way that soil and soil science is figured within and between large imperial states, especially the British Empire, Imperial Germany, Tsarist Russia, and the United States. While initially soil science might have facilitated the internal development of these states, by 1900, global soils had become perceived as a source of instability and crisis, which motivated intensified international cooperation and exchange between soil scientists. So the 19th century founder of the great Russian school of soil science, Vasily Dokuchev, for example, had no interest in foreign work in his field. Soil was locality incarnate for him. Russian soils like the taiga, the tundra, the Chernozem, the Black Earth, he believed were profoundly unique, as sui generis, as the Russians who worked them and studied them. And hence there was nothing to be learned from scientists who came from foreign lands. Well, after 1900, Dokuchev's students, he dies in 1904, were regular and important participants in international conferences. They were crucial figures in cosmopolitan soil science. So what changed? Well, soil science gained its largest impetus from the perceived global soil crisis that began in the 1870s and continued intermittently until the 1950s. And to a great extent, this global soil crisis was part of a global ecological crisis in imperial systems, the structural environmental breakdowns that Mike Davis called late Victorian holocausts, a series of droughts, famines, and epidemics that roiled India, China, Russia, Brazil, and many other countries, reaching peak intensity in the 1890s, but with critical aftershocks right through to the early 1940s. And as Davis described, these environmental catastrophes produced massive amounts of death and immiseration, uprooted large numbers of people into migration, and for those who stayed, provided impetus to anti-colonial resistance. Scientists in imperial metropoles responded to these crises and interpreted them in ways that could be addressed as scientific problems. Specifically, many regarded as a global crisis in soil fertility and soil erosion. So within the Russian Empire, for example, there was a soil-centric response to the Great Drought and Famine of 1891-92, which began in the Volga region and spread as far as the Urals and Black Sea by 1892, causing around 400,000 deaths. The 1891 drought provoked a heated public discussion about the extent of human and especially governmental responsibility for the drought, with political radicals like Georgy Plekhanov making harsh and lasting critiques of the Tsarist regime that continued to reverberate to the Russian Revolution of 1905. And part of the government response was a massive Russian push for soil science, resulting in the consolidation of the storied Russian School of Soil Science led by Dukochev and his students. There. So, and there were similar responses within the British and US context. The key moment in the English-speaking world came on the heels of the famous statement by the British chemist William Crookes in his 1897 presidential address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which warned of an impending crisis in the British Empire because of the nitrogen question. So Crookes warned that the population of the world's wheat-eating peoples was growing faster than farmers' ability to meet the demand, with global guano deposits rapidly becoming exhausted. Grave peril awaited the civilized nations if scientists failed to find new sources of nitrogen to replace the amounts lost perennially through grain cultivation. Showing less concerned about the fate of what he called the rice-eating peoples, Crookes cautioned that the great Caucasian race would cease to be foremost in the world and will be squeezed out of existence by races to whom the wheaten bread is not the staff of life. This is the 1890s moment that Jeff was referring to, really, in his talk as well, just on the eve of the Spanish-American War. Crookes' forecast of neo-Malthusian doom triggered fits of public anxiety. The wheat question, like the degeneration crisis, produced a fin de siècle moral and biopolitical panic, in this case linking the nutritional and biological health of the British Empire with its geopolitical power. And scientists and public officials in several countries responded with intellectual and institutional energy to Crookes' concerns. There was, in fact, very little new in Crookes' address, but its timing and dire geopolitical framing made it a catalyzing event. One outcome was, of course, the very chemical solution that he envisioned. Part of his purpose of his talk was really to mobilize chemists to work on the nitrogen question. The problem was solved, but not by British scientists, as he had hoped, but rather by the Germans, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, whose Haber-Bosch process succeeded in converting hydrogen and nitrogen to synthetic ammonia fertilizer, effectively solving the nitrogen question, although it took decades, 4 decades really, to be able to produce synthetic fertilizers at a global scale. And that's why we still have these famines in the 1940s. Because of this technical limitation, conventional broad gauge soil solutions were still urgently needed, and both the British Empire and the United States invested heavily in soil science as a direct response to Crookes' address. And Crookes' address was reprinted and summarized repeatedly in the US, for example, and I'll return to the US case in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit and consider, return to the ontological question with 2 examples, and these are both soil-based exhibits. The first is an artistic installation, and the second a work of historical commemoration. This first one might seem like a little bit of a digression, but I think it'll make more sense after we see the second one. So this is an installation. It's a triptych by the German artist Marianne Greve. It's called An Earth Altar, Eine Erde Altar. It was constructed in the 1990s. It was constructed actually initially for the Hanover World Expo, and then it found a permanent home in the Lüneburg Heath in Germany, just south of Bremen. And it consists of a collection of soil samples which in one sense evokes a scientific soil archive like the one at Rothamsted. But modern soil science was not Mariana Greve's purpose or point of departure. Instead, she tells us the story of Heinrich der Löwe, known in English as Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony in the 12th century, who returned from the Second Crusade with a sample of earth from Jerusalem, which he walled up in the altar of the Braunschweig Cathedral. Well, while Henry made the sacred soil of Jerusalem, the axis mundi of the Abrahamic faith, a sort of relic to be worshipped, Greve inverts all such hierarchies with soil, 7,000 soil samples from all directions of the planet, on the idea that all points on the globe are themselves sacred, all centers in their own right. So, somewhat arbitrarily, soil from Beijing and Auschwitz and the Polish city of Kolobrec sit alongside one another by chance. And as Greve points out in another place, the sacred book of the Dalai Lama sits right alongside the probe of a maid. And she goes on to say, the earth and the altar is a symbol for the diversity on our planet, for the community of the world's peoples, for the dependence upon soil upon which everybody lives. She continues here, the abstract perception of the entirety of the world into individual experiences of everyday uniqueness, earth from many places on the globe lets us realize our common dependence on the thin layer of weather-beaten stone from which life takes its nutrition and in which it leaves its traces. So there's a kind of warm, inclusive, non-hierarchical, unifying message to this exhibit. Well, let me contrast that with another exhibit. This is an archive. It's called the Soil Sample Archive of the Community Remembrance Project. It's found in the offices of the Equal Justice Institute in Atlanta, Georgia, a wonderful institution founded by Brian Stevenson. This soil sample archive is composed of jars of soil collected from lynching sites across the US to create a memorial to victims of lynching. The soil samples have been collected by communities and often descendants, and each jar is labeled with the name of one victim. This soil sample archive decisively corrects any notion that soil, land, or place is inherently unifying or supportive, reminding us that US soil has always threatened violence and exclusion for African Americans. The Soil Sample Archive is inextricably linked with the Equal Justice Institute's interactive map called Lynching in America, which invites viewers to both contemplate the broader geographical patterns of lynching, but also interactively to hone in on the stories of specific murders in particular places. Now, this combination of soil archive and mapping evokes as well the relationship of soil archives to soil maps in a somewhat uncanny way. And this is probably not coincidental, since the earliest maps of lynching in the US were produced by the research department of the Tuskegee Institute, which was also the leading center of soil science. Here's the Tuskegee map. This is produced in 1931. So although there's no mention of it in the exhibit's online materials, the peak era of lynching, 1890s to 1930s, coincided almost exactly with the years of the USDA soil survey, which historian Levi von Zandt has shown to have had a clearly a white supremacist order by facilitating the displacement of an exclusion of African Americans from productive lands. So this is these are two maps. These are bookended maps from this period, from 1899 to 1938 by the USDA soil survey. USDA surveys sought to promote high input, capital intensive agriculture, and they advanced exclusion under the guise of matching the right crop with the right soil, which is often code for enabling settlement of the right sort of farmer on the right land. So in this sense, soil surveying and lynching government science and terrorist murder could thus be seen to sometimes serve corresponding ends, forming common cause with a web of Jim Crow laws that rolled back African-American gains made during the Reconstruction era. Well, Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Institute, under the direction of the great agricultural scientist George Washington Carver, hired there in 1897, focused heavily on soil science. It was a major center of soil science, and it differed very consciously from the approach of the USDA soil surveys and also the work being done in state universities, in that it was aimed at helping poor Black sharecroppers to make a living out of marginal lands. And you can see these are a couple of, again, the dates kind of bookend this period. Here's a Tuskegee book, how to build up worn out soils. And here's a Carver authored piece called How to Build Up and Maintain the Virgin Fertility of Our Soils. And here's Carver in the field. So Tuskegee produced excellent soil mapping surveys of their own, such as this one in Macon County. That's the county in which Alabama, where Tuskegee is. And it's a kind of counter then to these US government surveys. Science for the Little Man, Carver called it. And all the books and pamphlets were designed to teach methods for farming these marginal lands. So I want to just make the final point that this soil sample archive of the Community Remembrance Project and Mariana Greva's An Earth Altar both assemble soil samples that in a manner that erase soil in radically different ways from the soil collections of the Rothlandson Station. Especially in the Community Remembrance Project, the explicit evocation of soil as a site of mourning and education refers implicitly to the soil as a site of scientific investigation. So that's kind of contained in this, in a kind of implicit dialogue. While reminding us that even science contained, even the science, the allegedly neutral project, contained within it a racist power politics. And it reminds us that even a simple realization of an entity mundanely called soil contains an ontological politics that scales onto a wider history of American internal colonization and settlement, and connects by further association with a perceived global crisis and a kind of sort of macro political sense of crisis and internal management that impelled soil science and all these mundane practices. So I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was very interesting, and I was just at a conference in Philadelphia where they also talked about George Washington Carver and also about Chris Hobart, so like soil science. Yeah, I know about this. And so I was particularly intrigued at the fact of that, you know, as you mentioned or alluded to at least, like that kind of colonial sentiment, especially it was like the 1900s speech, like how the wheat problem.
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And thinking also about how people tend to think, oh, well, Chris Hobart, he may have invented chemical weapons, but he also saved people's lives by doing the chemical reaction. And I feel like I'm wondering if these histories of soil science could be or should be perhaps more reflective of that type of how, you know, indigenous people have been doing like regenerative farming. Today, you now know that, you know, you don't just plant a bunch of wheat and let it keep growing every year, you swap it out, right? And it's interesting that type of history of how, you know, Europeans or, you know, in the early Americas, they're like, we're just gonna build these crops at the same time always, and oh no, what happens? And now we have to use chemistry, which may or may not have led into chemical warfare. And so I'm wondering just if you could speak to your thoughts, I guess, on, I mean, obviously it's not like I'm asking like, oh, we need a revisionist history, but how you think that type of really anti-indigenous, really not talking with other people, how that affects soil science.
Yeah, no, it's fundamental to the way I think about it. I mean, I referenced the slide Jeff put up in his plenary by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which talked about land, you know, is not just this property, you know, all that invoked
Yeah.
this idea of land. And yet for us, in that case, the indigenous people, it was everything and described this other kind of web of relations and so on. And I think that's in some sense the contrast.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a way of telling a story that would run through indigenous people. There's another way of telling the story that also we have a very different understanding of soil. And you mentioned regenerative farming. We understand it as this very dense multi-species environment. I mean, extraordinarily, just mind-bogglingly. So in that sense, we don't understand it very well, but it's a vastly more complex and this kind of reductive chemical entity than it was at the turn of the century. So part of what I'm saying, you just put your finger on the sense that my interest is in teasing out these different kind of meanings of soil as they're codified in scientific practices, and with that diversity there, but within that kind of political context, because it's in a context of crisis, an imperial crisis that drives a good deal of this, and then it drives the story needs to be expanded to kind of neo-Malthusian concerns about migration and settlement and too many people, and people are in the wrong places. All this, there's a whole lot of talk in the early 20th century. So there's a story that needs to be told. The other side of it too is that the soil is when we look at the planetary boundaries of the Anthropocene, soil is connected to 4 or 5 of them. So it's this very, very fundamental thing that needs to be rethought. So that's the motivation for the project more broadly. Yeah.
So this is fascinating stuff, and I need to get you to tell me how you found your way to soil science, because there must be a story there that's worth telling. But my question is about what I'm sure you've thought about how expansive this topic can be, but the missing sort of embeddedness for me that's in here has to do with geographical determinism and ideas about geomorphology.
Yeah.
In this same key 1890s to 1940s period as well.
Yeah.
Which have a particularly different kind of take in the regions of your 2 examples, the American context and the Eastern, particularly Eastern European context, German context. And so tell me about where geographical determinism and geomorphology might fit in.
The very first published paper I ever wrote was about geographical determinism in Germany in the 1850s. Jim heard the talk in 1988 in Manchester.
I wasn't even younger.
Part of the story, I just kind of mentioned Dukachev's geographical determinism. In that other talk, I was talking about a German called Bernhard von Cotta and his version of it, which was used in that case to both explain the diversity of German or Germanic peoples and their unity. So it's used geology and soil as an argument for German unification in that case. But a lot of that, it doesn't go away entirely. It continues in human geography, for example, and in a lot of places. It's less evident in the things that I'm looking at with respect to soil. Maybe you can correct. What's that?
I think maybe it's contained within it in the way that you're talking about things being contained within soil. It's just it's.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's there. It's a certain way of attending to soil, and it's an old trope.
I guess what I'm saying is maybe the piece is connecting it to those ideas about geomorphology and the kind of life cycle of the landscape, and it's shifting from mountains to eroded and so soil is a sort of stage in the life of the surface of the earth.
Yes. Yeah.
And so there's anyway.
Yeah. No. And they're beginning to think about nitrogen cycles and other atmospheric cycles and so on. And that becomes part of ecology, which has a certain amount of this.
So it just becomes everything.
It does. That's the problem with it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sure. Only because you recognize me, otherwise it would be.
It's also a site of resistances as well, and other ways of working rather than just the notion of one view that it gets imposed upon another. India is the classic example, right? With the struggles over the famines in 1942.
Yes.
It's Mahalanobis, who is an Indian national, that develops the new forms of statistical analysis of soil.
Yes.
And does resisting of the British mono notion from Fisher about what soil is about, and they develop two techniques: the sampling technique, which is completely different than the European, and the Mahalanobis distance function. Right?
Yeah.
And these are not, there's not something pure indigenous that's going on, and they're using tools that they get from Fisher to rework the soil and think about it differently, and then they use it as a form of resistance.
Yeah.
When it's just about soil, soil's something.
Yeah. No, it's a great example. George Washington Carver's a certain version. That's a brilliant one. And speaking of the Bengal famine of 1940.
That's what he was analyzing.
Yeah.
To use completely new statistical techniques.
Yeah. And India becomes one of the leaders in a kind of UN-focused soil research. I mean, enormous amounts of the UN, particularly UNESCO, but several UN bureaus were involved in soil research because it was seen, it was part of unraveling a lot of the colonialism, but it was also part of land reform movements and so on as well. So big, massive soil mapping projects globally, and then it all kind of dies about 1970. But India is really a key mover and shaker of that.
One last
Yeah.
question. Feel free to
I will definitely. But I want to ask you now, just because you frame this in terms of this at the beginning, going back to Jim's paper, I wanted to return our attention to that because I was intrigued by your suggestion that perhaps there was an issue with this move from the making to the communicating, and the ontological term might help, because I've been worried about the ontological term for some time, from the position of criticisms that come at it from the left, which is that it's an inherently conservative philosophy because it doesn't allow actual positions to be taken. And it's very woolly in the end. If everything has to be interpreted on its own terms, you can't actually take a political position yourself.
Yes, yeah.
And one of the things we've been talking with Jim about over the last few days is the way in which there's always this struggle between coming up with ideas and concepts and claims that are nice and friendly and soft, but ultimately really woolly, and claims that have a bit of political bite to them, but which are open to criticism. And it feels like I'm worried that you're moving from the political bite open to criticism to the kind of woolly.
Well, so yes, no, I completely get it. And in the knowledge in transit paper, Jim formulated that question in terms of the kind of first move towards locality in science and the tendency throughout the 90s to demonstrate some kind of extreme kind of locality that kind of deflated universalizing claims about science and so on. And so it made a certain kind of claim against, let's say, we could say the philosophy of science, but it retreated from big picture kinds of questions. And this is what I take you're referring to with the narrative scaling in your remarks on Wednesdays, that kind of concern. But in the knowledge in transit paper, this is where circulation movement and so on become part of a reconnection with bigger picture kinds of claims. And so I'm struggling with this too. And my way of bridging that gap is through in this paper was simply through evoking the narrative scaling point to link these things up, because I think they are connected. I mean, part of the question is, I mean, as someone who works in a history department, talking about those kinds of biting, strong questions, but also with an STS group, where we're often focused on science-related questions and all those kinds of things. I find myself moving back and forth, and I find that if I move too far in one direction, I start to get a little nervous. Somehow, the constant struggle is to bring those two things together, and it's hard because but yet that's kind of what we're trying to do, isn't it? I think, yeah. So, I don't know if that's an answer or not.